Gators Breakdown is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And joining me for this episode of Gators Breakdown is co-host and founder of readandreaction.com. That's Will Miles, and you can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. So, Will, it's time to kick off this our opponent previews for the season. Last episode we kind of just laid it all out. Not so much Charleston Southern, but from here on out, minus the Idaho game, we'll get the Gators Breakdown listeners for all the opponents Florida will face in this 2018 season.
Hey man, football. Can't wait to get started.
Absolutely. So remember, you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. There you'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes as well as articles from the News for Jax sports team. That's news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. Also, listen on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube if you want the video version, and follow Gators Breakdown on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. So, we'll like I said, kick it off with Kentucky, game 2 of the season, Florida's first in-conference game, first SEC game, and of course, we all remember the game Florida probably shouldn't have won last year, and Kentucky hasn't beaten Florida since all the way back in 1986, 10-3. That's been it, finding ways to lose over and over again for the last 31 years. Kentucky last year leaving the Florida wide receivers inexplicably wide open twice. But this is the one East opponent Dan Mullen knows very well, as Kentucky is Mississippi State's permanent crossover opponent in the conference. So Mullen went 8-1 versus Kentucky in his time there, with an average score of 34-21 Mississippi State. In that time span from 2009 to 2017, Florida was 9-0. This is Florida, Kentucky. So of course, 9-0 with an average score of 36-12. So kind of, in a way, as far as the offense goes, very similar when both teams played Kentucky ever since Dan Mullen was at Mississippi State.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd categorize the Gators win last year as lucky. I mean, whenever you leave the wide receiver uncovered twice, I mean, yes, that is Florida taking advantage of a breakdown in Kentucky's defensive schemes, but that's sort of that's sort of representative, I guess, of what bad teams do, right? So bad teams tend to leave guys uncovered, tend to let guys roam free down the field. And last year, the offense, especially after Del Rio came in, actually played pretty well. It was a defense that struggled in that game, and really that was sort of the story of the year for Florida in terms of the defensive play. But certainly Mullen is familiar with Kentucky, and so this isn't going to be new. He also is familiar with beating Kentucky when he was at Florida before he went to Mississippi State. So he's got that one loss on the board. So we're going to have to hold that against him because there's not a whole lot bad to look at for either one of those teams. And I think when you look at just the overall recruiting of both schools, the expectation is that Florida should beat Kentucky, both from a talent standpoint, but also just from a historical standpoint. Kentucky's a basketball school. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're a basketball school. And, they do have Florida in their sights just about every year. It's the one that they circle on the calendar. But the Gators should win that game based on the players that they have on the field.
Yeah, well, so, did mention Mullen, very familiar with Kentucky, but it is game 2 of Dan Mullen coming over to Florida. Still be trying to figure out who works where and trying to work the kinks out on offense and defense probably. But, that hasn't stopped past Florida coaches from coming in year 1 and being able to beat Kentucky and not losing since 1986. So, is it somewhat of a trap game just because it's game 2? It's Mullen's first big game. And Kentucky's probably a little more, with Stoops being there, a little further along of, they're not trying to figure things out, not necessarily as far as a new head coach coming in. But this is where I kind of think Mullen's being at Mississippi State and being the crossover across division opponent. He's very familiar with. So I don't necessarily look at this as such as a trap game as it could be.
No, and it's not as if Kentucky runs a triple option like Georgia Tech or anything like that. I mean, it's a pretty standard spread offense, and so we're not. It's nothing that Florida won't have seen. It's nothing that Florida won't recognize, and really, I think that when you look at where Florida was last year from a strength and conditioning perspective and where they should be coming into this year, there's no reason that they shouldn't dominate a game at home against Kentucky. Trap games, you and I talked a little bit about this last year. I kind of think that trap games are more when you get beat up, then you come out the next week and you don't play quite as well. Usually it's against a lesser opponent because you don't normally have two really, really high level opponents right next to each other. But, we sort of saw that last year with Georgia and Auburn. Georgia came in and got beat by Auburn because they were coming off some tougher games. So, I think in the second game of the year, the team should still be jacked. Granted, the home opener is a week before, but at the same time, it's not. It's a cupcake. It's not like it's Michigan this year. And so Kentucky is really sort of the first test for Mullen. And if he can't get his guys up in the second game, we got bigger problems than what's coming up on the schedule.
Yeah, and of course, it's already been announced it's a night game. So it will be SEC home opener for Dan Mullen and a night game at the Swamp. So, but talking about Kentucky, returning starters, 15 altogether. But just speaking on offense and defense, they have 8 on offense, 9 on defense. So this really, really starts at quarterback, and they have a lot of work to do there. Steven Johnson, the main guy for last few years, makes some plays with his legs and his arm, but he's no longer there. Drew Barker was also there. We remember seeing both of these guys a lot. When they would play Florida, we saw both of those guys the last couple of years. He's done. After spring practice, they, much like Florida, still have questions at quarterback. They don't have a starter in mind just yet. An Oregon transfer, Terry Wilson, makes plays with his legs, but and you'll get to some stats here. The passing abilities leave a lot to be desired there. And Gunnar Hoke is kind of the more pocket passer guy, 6'4", 206 pounds, a really nice arm. But we'll see where it goes. Will they want a guy who can try and create with his legs, or will they want somebody who can stand in the pocket strong and make plays with his arm?
Yeah, I think we need to go back to last year first off and say, okay, so Kentucky went 7-6, but they've profiled more like a 5 or a 6 win team. So they actually got outscored for the year. And so they were pretty fortunate to be 7-6 last year. And really, when you look at some of the underlying statistics, it's and considering that the miracle for Florida to win in Lexington last season, they're really probably more of a 5-7 team rather than a 7-6 team, 7-6 team. And that's with Steven Johnson at quarterback. And as you mentioned, now they've got either Terry Wilson or Gunnar Hoke coming in. And Wilson completed, everybody knows how much I enjoy looking at high school numbers, trying to project what these guys are going to do. And I actually think completion percentage is a place that you can look and see the translation. So Wilson completed 47.1% of his passes in high school, according to Max Preps, and he completed only 40.9% his senior year. So he went down from 50% to 40.9. Not a whole lot of attempts that are listed there. So maybe that's not an accurate representation of what he does. But again, that's something that you'd need to look at. If you look at Gunnar Hoke, he completed 67.8% of his passes with 261 attempts in 2014. So about 9.9 yards per attempt, which is lower than what you would want for an elite quarterback. It's more like the profile of what we saw for somebody like Luke Del Rio. So he completed about 70% of his passes in high school, but was in that 8 or 9 yards per attempt range. And so I think that's kind of what you're looking at with Gunnar Hoke, is that's probably about what you would think that you'd get from him. And Terry Wilson is going to have to make up some of the shortcomings with his arm by using his legs.
Yeah, and of course, we really know they have a beast at running back, and that's pretty much all they have on offense. That's a proven consistent threat, and that's running back Benny Snell, star of the offense, and the ground game gets going with him. And they had the ground game. It was just okay, even with a running quarterback with Johnson. But Snell probably get another 1,000. He'll probably be another 1,000-yard back again this year. Have another 2 guys, Seam Rose. A little bit of flash, but like I said, not much behind Snell. So this is an offense much like, I think, a lot like Florida again, in a way, is they're going to lean on a running back. They're nowhere near as deep at Florida at running back. So Snell will get a big time bulk of the carries. But much like Florida's offense, it's going to be focused on the run. Defenses will know it's coming. You'll just have to stop it.
Yeah, well, this is one of the places where I think Kentucky does have a considerable strength. So if you look at their offensive line, they've got Drake Jackson at center, who's a sophomore, but then they've got Gervonta Stallings, Logan Sternberg, and George Asafo Ajayi, who are all seniors, and then Landon Young at left tackle, who's a junior. And so those are two 4 stars and then three 3 stars on the offensive line. And you combine that with Snell and his ability, and you can see why they might be able to run the ball, particularly when you think about last year. They were pretty successful knocking Florida back in that game up in Lexington. Now, can they do that in Gainesville, where you got noise, a brand new quarterback, second game of the year? That's still to be seen. But the one thing I will say is that what you said about nobody being behind Snell is really going to matter in the fifth, sixth, seventh game of the year. But he's not going to be nicked up coming into that second game against Florida, and so. That's one of the things that we need to take into consideration is that Kentucky likely will be healthy, and so depth won't be as big of an issue. And so, that offensive line and the experience that they have on the offensive line, along with the experience of what they did last year, I think is a place where Kentucky can sort of hang their hat and say, hey, we did this last year. This is what we should be able to do this year.
Yeah, and now you try to look at the offense as the whole package, and we've mentioned quarterbacks, and they're still trying to figure that out, a weapon at running back. But if you go to receiver, they don't have a lot there either, and not a lot proven. And with Johnson at quarterback a lot, the receivers weren't getting a ton of targets anyway. The leading receiver, Garrett Johnson, and 4 of the top receivers are gone. So the playmaking ability there is really in question. Taven Richardson is their leading returner at receiver. And they have tight end CJ Conrad as well. But just talking about wide receiver, the passing game really needs some weapons to emerge, and only have one touchdown from the wideouts, and that's from Richardson return. So only one guy at the wide receiver position who has caught a touchdown pass. So another, you get a Dorian Baker who missed all of last year with an ankle problem. He'll help, but there's really not a lot. So we look at Snell and not a lot behind running back behind him. And then you go to receiver where only one guy who has any type of production returns. This is one of the main reasons that I picked Kentucky to finish dead last in the SEC East was I just don't see a whole lot on offense.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got 4-star tight end CJ Conrad, and I think he's somebody that they relied on last year, and did make some of Florida's linebackers look kind of foolish last year in that game. Lynn Bowden is a pretty high-rated 4-star wide receiver as well. But you mentioned Baker, you mentioned Richardson, and you mentioned just sort of a lack of production. Though you could make the argument about some of the players that get touted on some other teams, Florida included. You look at it and you say, hey, these guys are really, really high-quality players, but there hasn't been a whole lot of production on the field. In this case, though, you are right to point out that both the wide receivers and the quarterback have a lack of production. And so that's really where you would start to pick that an offense would struggle. Last year they weren't too bad, 332 points for. So, not terrible, but they weren't an elite offense by any means. And so losing the quarterback and losing those wide receivers, you would expect them to take a step back. And considering that the defense was pretty bad last year, it's going to be a struggle for them, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I've always been a proponent of Stoops too, not really bringing a strong defense to Kentucky. So that's why I think they're going to have to score some points. And they can get timely scoring at times, and that's how they were able to put some to some wins together last year. But with the lack of a passing game and no explosion from skill spots, last year they hung 40 up on Missouri and 44 on Vanderbilt, but not enough of those performances that we've come to see from offenses that can consistently get it done. So if you go back to 2016, offense wasn't great, but it did score 35 more points. 35 points or more 7 times. But last year, those 2 games where I mentioned they scored 40 and 44 against Missouri and Vanderbilt, that was it. So over the last 7 years, Kentucky is 14-2 when they score 35 or more points. So there is a key stat there where if they can, and a lot of teams could probably speak to that. You get 35 points, you're going to win a lot of games. But in particular, Kentucky, because as I said, Stoops hasn't been able to bring a defense where I've been that we expect to see from when he was hired. We expected to see some tougher defenses at Kentucky, and they've recruited better under him as well. But I've yet to see a defense where I'm just really, really impressed with what they're doing. So they're going to have to score points.
Yeah, well, so if you look overall at Kentucky's recruits for their starting 22. It's an 87.1 rating at 24/7 and 87.0 for the defensive line. And those are the two areas I really tend to look at, is the overall talent and then the talent on the defensive line. And then you look at the quarterback. And so in all of those places, they're behind Florida. So Florida's at 91.3 overall, 91.8 on the defensive line. So really 4 percentage points higher than Kentucky. And you figure that the quarterback position at Florida, I mean, this is one of the times where we can say we're not definitively worse than the opponent. And so, but Florida's got some work to do. I mean, 4-7 was not an accident last year for the Gators, and they're going to have to, I think everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. But at the same time, you're a 4-7 team, so to take anybody for granted, I think, is a mistake, particularly with some of the struggles on defense last year. So, we'll see. I think the having Kentucky first is or having them second after the cupcake game is is a positive thing for Florida, because it's a way to build momentum. If you remember a couple of years ago when Luke Del Rio really let it loose in the swamp against Kentucky, and it was sort of an avalanche. They hit the one long pass to Callaway, and then Kentucky just couldn't get its bearings. And I think the same thing could happen in the swamp this time, especially with a quarterback who's making his first road start, and that's where he's making his first road start. And that's going to be a difficult ask for whoever's the quarterback at Kentucky.
Yeah, kind of looking at some of the numbers we just talked about before we move on to the defense. Last year for passing touchdowns, opponents had 21 passing touchdowns. Kentucky only had 10.
But weren't like 3 of them against Florida?
Oh, yeah.
I remember Marco Wilson getting beat towards the corner of the end zone. There was a pass to Conrad. I don't remember whether there was a third one, but it was at least 2.
Right, yeah.
So
they only had 8 for the rest of the year. That we know of. It could be 7, yeah.
Again, there's still some work to do, and we need to be cognizant of that. So, I think really what we're hanging our hat on here is that Mullen is going to take the talent that Florida has and make it perform at the level that people are accustomed to seeing it at. Now, you expect the improvements in the strength and conditioning program, and also with some of the other improvements that he's making in the program, that's what's going to happen. I don't think Florida was as bad as 4-7 last year. I don't think Kentucky was as good as 7-6 last year. So even if you think Florida is maybe a 6-6 team, and I haven't really made up my mind in terms of where I think the Gators are going to finish, but even if you think Florida's a 6-6 team, they're probably better than Kentucky.
Yeah. We'll move to the other side of the ball right now. We talk about defense here. A defense that should be better, and that's where counting experience as well. 10 starters back, including 9 of the top 10 and 15 of the top 17 are back for this Kentucky defense. So, but what type of experience are you bringing back? That's the question when you start talking about experience. They have to do better in late in games. Outscored 106-73 in the fourth quarter last year during the season. The defense allowed 42 points or more in 3 of the last 5 regular season games and lost every one of them.
Yeah, we talked about how Florida has struggled on defense, and certainly we saw it last year. The Gators gave up 222 points in the SEC, and Kentucky gave up 246. So Kentucky's defense was worse than Florida's, and Florida's defense was not very good, at least from a Florida perspective. Sort of mid-tier, maybe 60th overall, but Kentucky was even worse. And, like you said, Stoops comes from a defensive background, comes from being a defensive coordinator, so it's been kind of a surprise that he hasn't been able to put together a defense that's a little bit more comprehensive, or at least just able to put together schemes that can slow down other teams. I mean, Kentucky, I guess you had that stat earlier where when they score more than 35, they don't lose. But I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of 34-30 games that they maybe lose in bed, because I do recall them being in a few shootouts in his time there. The one thing I'll say, and with all the returning starters coming back, and we noted this last year, is that their defensive backs are really tall. And they're really rangy. And so somebody like Kadarius Toney is somebody who can really take advantage of that, and took advantage of it last year. Being able to get him on the outside, shift. Somebody like Tyree Cleveland may have a little bit harder time against some of those taller DBs who can go up for jump balls and fight them for him. But somebody like Toney should be able to get the kind of separation that you would want to see against some of those defensive backs. And it'll be interesting to see how Mullen decides to attack that.
Yeah, because the secondary does need to make some plays. They were the second worst pass defense in the SEC last year. So it makes you wonder if this is a chance Mullen can see the pass game going. But last year, Mississippi State still just kind of ran the ball crazy on Kentucky last year. So they gave up more than 200 yards or more in every game last year in the secondary. So, but Mike Edwards, the safety, is the leading tackler. He returns this year, and Darius West is a guy who can lay the wood back there too. Yeah, the corners, they're physical, but they just don't do anything that necessarily stands out. Of Derek Beatty and Lonnie Johnson, need some help in the pass rush if they go there too. Denzel Ware, Josh Allen, their main playmakers, have 30 sacks on the season last year. The defensive line did, but on a regular basis, that's where they just couldn't get anything. They were not consistent at all. They were second to last in the SEC in tackles for a loss. So if you look at probably why their pass defense was so bad, it worked in tandem. They weren't consistent enough up front, and the guys in the back end are just aren't athletic enough to make plays on their own.
Yeah, well, if you look at it, Josh Allen and Jordan Jones were the guys really getting the tackles for loss, along with Denzel Ware last year. And so, Ware's gone, and then you've got Allen and Jones at linebacker. And it's great when your linebackers are making plays like that, but at the same time, it is sort of indicative when your defensive line doesn't have a whole lot of tackles for loss, that it's indicative that there's an issue there. And I think that's true. I mean, I just think that's something that that there isn't the talent on the defensive line that you really need to compete in the SEC. I mean, he's running a 3-4, and even if you look at his starters, the average for the defensive line is 87.0 for the 24/7 rating. So it's not a highly recruited defensive line, and I think it shows in terms of being able, and that's the first line, and so the second line is going to be even lower. And as you go, they can't rotate in 7 different guys like a team like Florida or other big boy SEC schools should be able to do, because they just don't have the depth, and that's going to show up eventually. And if you can run and knock those guys back, then you can neutralize the linebackers. And that's really, I think, what happens in the second half is the linebackers get neutralized as the defensive line gets tired, and then you can't get any pressure on the quarterback. And that's really what happened last year, where Del Rio came in and certainly looked a lot better than Franks did in the game. But I also think a lot of that had to do with Florida held the ball for a really long time, was able to tire out the Kentucky defense, and then eventually take advantage of some of the mental mistakes that were made.
Yeah, looking at this defense, the key is going to be they need to create some turnovers. First half of the season last year, forced 13 turnovers in the first 5 games, and they went 4-1. And Florida being one of those, that being the one loss. So you could say they could have, should have, would have been 5-0. But the last 8 games of the season, only 5 takeaways, and 4 of them came against Vanderbilt. So they failed to come up with a turnover in the 5 of the last 7 games. So that's it. You can definitely see what helped so much at the beginning of the season and how it fell apart toward the end of the season. Turnovers were a huge factor in their defense and any kind of success they were having.
Yeah, well, and that sort of goes to what we talked about with depth, right? I mean, that as the players get tired, as you start to get injuries, and you don't have people who can put pressure on the quarterback to make him throw it up for interceptions, who can hit somebody from behind and get the strip, those sorts of things. All of a sudden, then the turnovers don't come, and it's really, turnovers are great, and they do usually tell the story from game to game. But we talk a lot on here about process. And so if the turnovers are part of being able to get consistent pressure on the quarterback, then it's great. If they're sort of fluky to start out with, and you're relying on them in order to stop the opposition, then that's a problem. And so, that I think is what you see with Kentucky, where the defense, when it gets turnovers, is able to get off the field, but when it doesn't, is not able to get off the field. And we definitely saw that in the game against Florida last year, that just, once Franks was gone, they got Del Rio off the field on the 1 interception on the first drive he came in. But after that, they could not get Florida off the field, and it cost them the game.
Well, that's the offense and defense kind of preview for Kentucky. Anything else stick out about Kentucky when we're going through all their other preseason looks right now?
No, I mean, it's interesting because the the biggest thing for this game is just, at some point you figure that there will be a fluke and they have to win one. And you wonder what it is. I mean, the Kentucky media ends up just picking every year. That way they'll feel like they look smart if they happen to be right. But I think I mean, Florida is going to be jacked for this game because it's the first SEC game of the year. It's at home. The crowd is still going to be nuts even after the first one, especially if the first game looks really good. We've all seen the enthusiasm for people with Dan Mullen at head coach. It's not going to wane after a game with Charleston Southern, and so this one's going to be a tough one for Kentucky.
Yeah, well, it would be a good chance for Florida to start 2-0. Get started on the right foot of the season, and you don't want to be the first coach to lose to Kentucky in quite some time. That would not be a good look and a good start for the Dan Mullen career at Florida. But with all things said, this is a game Florida should win, much like they have been recently. We've had some really great games, between Florida and Kentucky. You go back to some games in the Swamp where Driscoll and DeMarcus Robinson had to hook up in overtime, and you had the blowout, like you mentioned earlier, with Luke Del Rio being probably it was definitely the best game of his career by far, and when he just lit Kentucky up in the Swamp a couple seasons ago. But there's just been some knockdown dragouts lately, and then one of the just oddest games you'll ever see, last year's game.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk, and I don't know how much stock I put into it. The players really need confidence. I mean, I feel like once you get to this level of being this kind of an elite athlete, that confidence is probably overrated. But at the same time, if there is something to that, Florida is going to be building confidence coming in here, and if the Charleston Southern game is a fun-filled blowout, and then the Kentucky game can follow suit in the same fashion, then certainly heading into some of the tougher games of the year, they will be, from a confidence perspective, they'll be riding pretty high.
Absolutely, absolutely. Will, anything else before we let this Kentucky preview go?
No, I don't think so, man.
All right. Be sure to check out the next preview, Colorado State, the Jim McElwain Bowl, Will. So there we go. That'll be one to kind of look forward to. Just as I think the side storyline is more interesting than the actual game itself there. But remember, you can find Will on Twitter, Will Miles on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.